Now, if you mix the meat and potatoes, or just meat and carbohydrate of some sort, then what will end up happening is the insulin to glucagon ratio will end up skyrocketing and going flying high. That means there are very, very high levels of insulin about, because all the glucose is being prevented from entering. And that's a big deal, because that is how you get your diabetes happening. It's from all of that glucose being locked out. We already know that our body will stimulate glucagon and it will not increase the amount of insulin. This means that we will be losing weight. Why exactly does meat cause diabetes? And more importantly, why does it not cause diabetes at the same time? Yes, that might sound very, very strange. Now, even though that statement was completely contradictory to itself, there is actually some truth to it, and it's because under the right circumstances, meat does cause diabetes, and under the right circumstances, meat also doesn't cause it. So what exactly is going on? Now, in order to do this, we are going to have to understand the insulin to glucagon ratio, and we are also going to have to understand the Randle cycle, which will explain exactly why meat does and does not cause diabetes. So we already know that type 2 diabetes basically is pretty much just where there's chronically elevated levels of insulin, and the cells eventually develop insulin resistance. And we also know that the catabolic state in particular, the state where your body will burn fat no matter what, is determined by glucagon. This basically means that high levels of insulin leads to high level of weight gain, and high levels of glucagon leads to high levels of fat burning. Now, in order to do this, we're going to have to understand what exactly happens when we eat meat and only meat on the insulin to glucagon ratio. And the insulin to glucagon ratio is just the ratio between insulin and glucagon, and which one is more favored or which one is less favored. Now, when insulin is more favored in particular, this insulin to glucagon ratio will usually be around 1.6 or a little bit higher. And when glucagon is favored, this insulin to glucagon ratio will be a little bit below that, and it could even get to 0.9 or 0.8. Now, when we eat meat and only meat in a fasted state, we already know that our body will stimulate glucagon and it will not increase the amount of insulin. This means that we will be losing weight if we are eating meat and only meat in a fasted state. And this will in turn make the insulin to glucagon ratio more glucagon favored. Now let's do the exact opposite, except let's eat potatoes or some sort of carbohydrate in the fasted state. Now, when we eat carbohydrates in the fasted state, insulin will end up spiking. And even though insulin will end up spiking, it won't spike that high. The reason this happens is because carbohydrates, once again, they get converted into glucose and insulin, they go together. However, this is where meat actually can cause diabetes. And this is when you mix meat and potatoes. Now, if you mix the meat and potatoes, or just meat and carbohydrate of some sort, then what will end up happening is the insulin to glucagon ratio will end up skyrocketing and going flying high. Now, when I say it goes flying high, this means that insulin is primarily favored. And we already know that insulin in particular dictates whether or not the body will store weight. And yes, the body will store a lot of weight, which explains a lot of the obesity epidemic in today's day and age. Now, we already know that mixing these two will cause this, but more specifically, why does it cause this? Well, this is where we have to look at the Randle cycle in order to understand in a little bit more detail what's going on. Now, the Randle cycle is basically where the cells will either choose to use fatty acid as fuel, or they will choose to use glucose as fuel. Now, they can't do both, and when your cells choose to use fatty acid for fuel in particular, then what will end up happening is glucose will be blocked out of the cell and it will not allow the glucose to enter the cell. However, when fatty acid is not being used as fuel and instead glucose is being used as fuel, what ends up happening is the fatty acid gets blocked out of the mitochondria and it cannot enter the mitochondria. Now, this is a big deal. Now, let's look at what happens when we eat meat. Now, when we eat meat and only meat, as we can see, glucose ends up getting blocked out of the cell. However, we also see that fatty acid is being used as fuel. Now, we already know that meat in particular does not stimulate high amounts of glucose. So we will not have to worry about high levels of blood glucose happening during this state. Now, let's look at the other side when we end up using glucose as fuel and when we're eating potatoes and only potatoes. As we can see, this means that our body will be able to use glucose as fuel. However, it will not be able to use fatty acid as fuel. Now we are going to mix both of these. And what happens when we choose to mix both the meat and the potatoes? Well, when we mix the meat and the potatoes, what ends up happening is the cell will block both out, and it will block the fatty acid out of the mitochondria, and it will block the glucose out of the cell. Now, when it is out of the cell, yes, you might have guessed it, that means there are very, very high levels of insulin about, because all the glucose is being prevented from entering. And that's a big deal, because that is how you get your diabetes happening. It's from all of that glucose being locked out. Now, this is why eating meat, and only meat in particular, will not cause diabetes, because you are not actually increasing high amounts of glucose being blocked out of the cell. In fact, almost no glucose is being made, and you usually actually have lower blood glucose when you're carnivore. However, this also means that going vegan will also work as well, because it will cause less damage to the endothelium. However, I don't recommend that, and the reason is for a lot of reasons, not just inflammatory markers from phytotoxins, but also that glucose is not the primary energy source of the cell. In fact, the cell definitely prefers fatty acid, and that has to do with all the damage that is caused during glucose oxidation. Now, if you're really interested in the scientific detail behind all that, I recommend you check out my Science Behind Carnivore playlist, because it explains all of this in way more detail. So, thanks for watching. Like, comment, and sub if you found the video helpful. And if you're really interested in supporting the channel, then please click the join button down below, which is where you can help me personally grow the channel. And without further ado, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.
Gotta make a wrong